The World of Suzie Wong was released in 1960 and is a fun British-American produced romance about Suzie Wong, played by Nancy Kwan, who's a Chinese sex worker based in the Wan Chai district of Hong Kong, and Robert Lomax, played by William Holden, an American trying to start a new career as a painter. When he arrives in Hong Kong, he encounters Suzie, who pretends to be a virtuous daughter of a wealthy businessman. Lomax sees Suzie coming out of a hotel in Wan Chai and rents a room there, unaware that this is where Chinese prostitutes take their white clients, and thus, slowly a romance develops. The film was adapted from the stage play by Paul Osborne, which itself was based on the 1957 novel by Richard Mason, which I'm going to be referencing a lot too. This video is already off topic, as the film I'm focusing on and the book it was based on aren't East Asian. However, as I'm white, British and a man who dedicates a lot of my time looking at films from the East, especially Hong Kong, I think it's sometimes useful to explore the perceptions of these places and their people from my own historical and social cultural lens. This gives people like myself the opportunity to understand, or even simply acknowledge, certain biases or assumptions I have about somewhere like Hong Kong due to the culture I was raised in, which will undoubtedly affect the way I read into the films produced from these places, especially regarding, in the case of this video, women. Now it's important to note, I'm not trying to demonise the film or book, or get them cancelled, or even score so-called woke points, whatever that means. I'm just attempting to show that it provides us with a useful insight into the development of how East and Southeast Asian women are viewed from Western eyes, specifically how it reflects what Peter Kwan framed the construction of the Oriental woman, which for him was a fictional character of the Western imagination. The so-called Oriental woman, seen in Western productions and literature, was so much a part of the Western imagination, and by contrast, so far away from the realities of these actual women, that it exists as its own separate abstraction. So when I use the phrase Oriental woman, I'm not actually referring to East and Southeast Asian women, but a fictional projection of Western white men's idea of them. The Oriental woman traditionally has certain characteristics. She's meek, shy, passive, childlike, innocent, and naive. When referring to the Oriental woman and their romantic relationships with white men in Hollywood films, Gina Marchetti described them as being often depicted as sexually available to the white hero, and due to her being an invention of the Western imagination, is ultimately dependent on the white hero to satisfy her most basic needs and to perform essential tasks. It's unavoidable not to associate this with Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, where, within this context, writers and artists view themselves and their subject matter within sexist binders. This was common in the writings of travellers and novelists, where women are the creatures of male power fantasies, and led to people like Peter Kwan arguing that this could explain why the white hero finds the Oriental woman extremely sexually desirable, because she was essentially created exactly for this. Kwan writes, "This racial sexual fetish is often cast and recast in colonialist terms that reinforce the subjugation of the Oriental woman and posit her as an object for Western consumption and the satisfaction of Western desires. The Oriental woman is therefore available to satisfy desires that would normally otherwise be socially and morally unacceptable if acted upon the bodies of white women." This is why there's a deep history of the Oriental woman being used to permit taboo desires like paedophilia, sexual aggression and violence, something that was not reserved solely for the white woman within a colonial context. We can see this sexual exclusivism in the old British colonial censorship practices in Hong Kong, where it was emphasised that the white woman must not be sexualised in front of Chinese audiences, yet Chinese women were not focused on in this way. I explore this in my 5 weird Hong Kong censorship practices video, so if you want a more detailed dive into that, check that video out. Mark Hampton wrote an amazing chapter called A Man's Playground in his book, which provides a detailed account of how Hong Kong was essentially treated like a leisurely gentleman's club. In the book, he shows how British commentators imagined Hong Kong as a site of unbridled capitalism, which contrasted with the dreary welfare state of post-World War II Britain. But alongside the glorification of entrepreneurship was a place where men could play. In particular, it entailed the vision that Hong Kong was a sexual playground for the British man, which was characterised by its easy access to Asian women. John Tosh argued that empire was seen as a projection of masculinity, and as Claire Midgley noted, British imperialism was essentially a masculine project. The operation of the British Empire and Victorian expansion was, according to Ronald Haim, underpinned with sexual dynamics, and a territory like Hong Kong provided British men sexual opportunities that would not have been readily available in Britain. The trope of Hong Kong being a sexual decadence wasn't just familiar to those living there, but also British people living at home, as it became a common theme in text aimed for them. However, it was overwhelmingly masculinist, as European female sexuality was hardly ever depicted when it came to Hong Kong, and the sexualising of Asian women was essentially normalised, as overt criticism of men who discreetly enjoy Asian mistresses and sex workers was also rare. Mark Hampton cites a segment by historian Jan Morris, where they talk about the male experience in Hong Kong. From the beginning, Hong Kong seems to have been more prurient even than most such colonial settlements, partly because of the climate perhaps, partly because European males have always been attracted to nubile Chinese females, partly because the early settlers were often men of vigorous appetite and flexible morals, and partly because the air of Hong Kong somehow seems to suggest that in sex, as with most other things, anything goes. This theme of the availability of Asian women was intersected with another motif associated with Hong Kong, commercialism, and was present in many books, journalistic accounts, memoirs, and letters in the post-war era. In Hong Kong, sexual delights, like everything else, was for sale, whether it be through prostitution or a mistress with a Hong Kong woman who's living in poverty. A motivation behind Suzie Wong's availability is feeding her young child, which resonates with the Anna character in Donald Moore's The Striking Wind, a Hong Kong seductress who turns to prostitution to pay for her parents' medical bills and escape the living conditions of desperate poverty. Missionary Jackie Pullinger also observed the connections between poverty and sex work in 1960s Hong Kong, and how this often compromised the agency of the woman. She refers to a mother who sold her daughter to a pimp due to her husband leaving and there being no social security payments in Hong Kong. But then again, the commercial availability of Asian women was also due to local women being attracted to the finer things that their class and social status could never provide them with. As the narrator in the book, The Great Hong Kong Sex Novel, states, it was hard for a good girl with a bad job to dress reasonably in Hong Kong. We see this with Suzie, in how she's able to cope with having sex with a man she doesn't love, saying, "I'll just close my eyes and think, what a nice easy way to get a new dress." This notion that sex work in Hong Kong was the most prosperous way women could earn money was so deeply rooted. During a 1970s pay dispute in a wig factory, the women workers were told, if you're all so money conscious, why don't you become bar girls? As so-called more respectable forms of employment would always be financially limited for them. This left Hong Kong women in a lose-lose situation, where they could either be unrespectably poor in a respectful job or lifestyle, or financially comfortable in an unrespectful job or lifestyle. Nevertheless, the culture of Hong Kong being a commercial playground full of available Asian women was not exclusive to British men, but white men from all over, and many would even develop savvy systems of knowing where to go and what to avoid. One of the many examples of this is the book Bachelor's Guide to Hong Kong, a painstakingly researched and even more painstakingly creepy guide on how to pick up girls in Hong Kong. The book has a raw commercialist tone, typical of Western attitudes towards Hong Kong in general, where it treats the pursuit of Asian women's bodies akin to getting the best deal on a car. The book promises that it will teach how to get value for your money, how to avoid being ripped off, and how to play the game. You see, you can learn by my mistakes. You don't have to go to 10 bars in the evening, as I did before finding the good ones. You can go directly to the right bar and act quickly. saving time and money. The sexual availability of Asian women was so important regarding the promotion of Hong Kong's tourism revenue, the British colonial government took note, and it was tactically endorsed by the Hong Kong Tourism Authority, especially with the influx of American soldiers and sailors during the Vietnam War. So it was safe to say that whilst the male sexual opportunity was a key theme within British representations of Hong Kong, according to Mark Hampton, neither the discourse nor the opportunity belonged to Britons alone. In fact, the most famous fictional portrait of Hong Kong Chinese female sexuality and prostitution involved a white American, that being the film version of The World of Suzie Wong. Hampton claims, to which I agree, that the film specifically can be seen as an American co-opting of British discourse concerning Asian female sexuality, as the novel humanises Suzie, whereas the film glamorises her. The novel exposes the deep social problems within British Hong Kong, yet the film sharpens the focus more on an individual damsel in distress archetype. The film also replaces the more seedy British protagonist with a noble American character, played by one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. The novel centres on a restless British novelist and his affair with a desperately poor squatter who works as a prostitute in a brothel disguised as a hotel. Hampton also refers to how the hotel brothel's very existence is a testament to what the male protagonist, Lomax, regards as British hypocrisy. What was once a reasonably, though not perfect, regulated brothel system had been outlawed by meddling London politicians, which ended up giving way to uncontrolled street walking and disease. It went from brothels having official licenses to simply pretending they didn't exist, but obviously they still did. It was just now more unstable and dangerous. Also, in the book, the writer Richard Mason describes the hierarchy of sex workers in Wan Chai, where the dance hall girls look down on the hotel girls and the bar girls look down on the street girls. However, in the hotel brothel Nam Gok, despite the quarrels and jealousy, there was essentially a code of honour. If a sailor takes a woman upstairs, then he becomes assigned to her, and whenever he returns, she will be the one that he sees. These women see themselves as better than prostitutes, and often try and blend in genuine romance within their commercial motivations. These regulars are often treated like boyfriends. This doesn't mean, however, that they can't have multiple regulars, as Suzie herself has more than one. Nevertheless, Lomax is still treated as a special case, as, unlike his white peers, who boast about how Hong Kong provides the opportunity for men to express their polyamorous nature and normalise having a mistress, Lomax has monogamous romantic intentions with Suzie and wants to take her back to England despite the social prejudice. Both the book and the film presents Lomax as a white knight, a term I'll come back to later, whose sincere and committed affection for Suzie will eventually save her. Yet, reality doesn't concur with this fantasy. According to Sean O'Callaghan, Hong Kong's sexual opportunity came at a great cost for the real woman who Suzie's character was based on. A friend of his was able to track her down and put together this description, which I'm going to warn you is problematically worded to say the least. She was a fat, dirty, disease-ridden whore of about 35, living in abject poverty in one of the back alleys of Wan Chai. Once she may have looked like Nancy Kwan, who played the title role, but drink and disease had so transformed her that she looked like any of the other 1,000 or so prostitutes who beg or search the garbage tins for a living when their looks are gone and they're no longer of any value to their masters, the traffickers. The romantic construct of Suzie being an Oriental woman who was readily available to white men and thus will live a happy life was, like the idea of the Oriental woman in of itself, a total fantasy. As the real inspiration for Suzie suffered the realities of what this Western projection concealed, whether intentionally or not. This fantasy is, for me, equivalent to the capitalist laissez-faire utopia that Britain and the US had projected onto Hong Kong in general. But it's important to address the more nuanced characteristics of the world of Suzie Wong, particularly the interesting way the Oriental woman and white hero are depicted, as it's not quite straightforward. Lomax is presented as a hero because he actually overcomes the racial and class bigotry of the white elite establishment in Hong Kong, the one even he himself relies on. Lomax is a loving white hero who, as I referred to earlier, contrasts with the other white men in the film who use Chinese women only for their sexual pleasure. This is shown through his initial rejection of Susie's sexual advances. Instead, he channels his attraction for her through his art. Lomax's intentions are noble and even quite progressive for its time. This is partly what makes the film so fascinating. It can easily be seen as not subscribing to traditional Orientalist themes, especially if we compare it to something like Madama Butterfly, where the white male character is an abuser of the Oriental woman. Also, unlike Madama Butterfly, Susie's not a virginal and self-sacrificing Asian woman. She's a sex worker who only fantasizes about being a virgin. However, the World of Suzie Wong is still a Hollywood film and is constructed within the Orientalist genre. As Kwan puts it, the film is dependent on Oriental assumptions for its narrative effect. In fact, the figure of the Oriental woman is repackaged for the audience of its time in ways that makes the Oriental woman palatable. Susie's Oriental woman identity is established when she's first invited to Lomax's bedroom. When Susie is informed of the invite, she becomes almost childishly excited. Yet, when she realises that he doesn't want to have sex with her, only wishing for her to pose for his painting, she's both disappointed and humiliated. The scene reinforces two things: Susie's sexual availability as an Oriental woman, and Lomax's virtue as the white hero. Yes, the film isn't fully submersive of the Oriental woman construct, but it still reflects motifs that the 1960 audience would immediately recognise. Unlike Madama Butterfly, which was a classic representation of the Oriental woman, where the white male hero is presented as a player and only appreciates the value of the Oriental woman after she commits suicide. In the World of Suzie Wong, on the other hand, it's the Oriental woman who is cast as the morally questionable character. Lomax provides the moral compass in the film as the self-controlled artist. It's Lomax's virtue that ultimately vindicates and transforms Suzie, which again contrasts with Madama Butterfly, where it's the guilt over the Oriental woman's suicide and the nobility of it that vindicates and reforms the white hero. The Oriental woman's availability and her perceived willingness to serve as a sexual object are necessary elements of her constructed anatomy, and despite it being purely fantasy, it's such a reality regarding white men's expectations. Asian women like Suzie realise they have few options but to play to the role. This is shown quite clearly in the novel, where, despite the fact Suzie has worked the streets since an early age, after being sexually abused by her uncle, she's portrayed as being incredibly shy and coy about undressing in front of Lomax. She presents herself as being so timid and bashful that she can't turn the light off herself and asks him to do it for her. But this modesty is obviously a farce. Susie's playing a role, one that is essential when pandering to the allure of the Oriental woman fantasy. Another interesting element of the film is how Lomax works as the white knight archetype, which interplays well with the Oriental woman construct. According to Gina Marchetti, stepping out of the medieval romantic quest tales and into the present day, the heroic knight promises salvation from any number of woes, ranging from simple lack of self-esteem, boredom and sexual frustration, to poverty, oppression, or the stifling confines of the family. As Sicha Man points out, the heroine is absolved by her passivity of any guilt related to the sexual nature of the fantasy. The knight spies her, finds her worthy, and scoops her up. She need not lift a finger. The myth of the white knight circulates within a Western culture that has continuously defined itself against what it has identified as the non-white other, from the Moor or the Jew of the medieval imagination to the black, Asian or Hispanic of today. Thus, the myth operates to perpetuate not only gender inequalities, but racism as well. Clearly, the knight's whiteness signifies his moral purity, his unquestionable natural right to carry the heroine away without being accused of abducting her. As the White Knight, Lomax is by default morally virtuous, and Suzie is fallen. Her virtue is only a role that she plays. After he declares his love for Suzie, she begins to imitate what she thinks a white woman would act like, and tells him that she would never sleep with a man on the first night. After leaving his room briefly, she walks back in and pretends a day has passed. She continues the roleplay, telling Lomax that he will be the first man she's ever slept with. He also acts as if it's his first time as well. Two pure virgins who have saved themselves for each other. Lomax, as the White Knight, achieves the impossible. He turns Suzie into a virgin so she can offer herself up to him. His sexual conquest is represented as Suzie's salvation. The heroic role that Lomax achieves is only possible because of Suzie's condition as an Oriental woman, which means the Oriental woman exists to facilitate the role of the White Knight for the white male protagonist. For this to be made possible, the Oriental woman needs to play the role of what Kwan called the morally needy, represented here as corrupt and fallen. Otherwise, the White Knight wouldn't be able to offer her salvation, suggesting that the pursuit for the Oriental woman is not just a readily available indulgence, but somewhat a moral responsibility or necessity. Kwan argues that this moral justification for the sexual ravishment of the Oriental woman is not only relevant to the salvation fantasy, but it's also supported by the fantasy of conquest, where the geopolitical conquest is co-synthetic with corporeal conquest. This is evident in Suzie's seduction scene in the book, where she's visually described in a way that suggests Lomax is not simply about to make love to a Chinese woman, but as her silhouette merges against the sky in the open balcony door, the sky over the mainland, the sky of China, Lomax is in fact about to lay claim to China. In the book, the author reduces Suzie to a mere silhouette, as if the more Lomax expresses his desire, the further Suzie's individuality diminishes. When Suzie's transformed into a silhouette, she becomes simply an object of Lomax's seductive desires, which, as Kwan asserts, exposes the way in which the colonial and the ideological are never far away from the racial and the sexual. Lomax's conquest of Suzie's Oriental body resonates with the geopolitical context in which the seduction takes place, namely the history of Western colonization of Asia, in this case the British control over Hong Kong. There's also a much darker take on this Oriental woman construction, as it not only permits the exploitation of East and Southeast Asian women through the lens of sexual fantasy, but it's also a vehicle for violence. An issue that has recently become topical in popular media due to 2020 and 2021's increase in anti-Asian hate crimes, a significant percentage being against women, especially the Atlanta spa shooting, that incited conversations about how Asian women have historically been used as scapegoats for white men's sexual hang-ups. But let me be very clear, the World of Suzie Wong does effectively present a moving love story between a white American man and a Chinese woman. Yet, what Kwan frames white on yellow violence is scripted throughout the film and normalised within this Orientalist framework. There's a scene where a white drunken sailor tries to get Suzie's attention, but after rejecting him, he knocks her to the ground. When he finds out, Lomax ends up throwing the sailor out of the hotel and cleans the blood off her face. But later on, just before Suzie enters a bar, she deliberately bites onto her own lip to make it bleed more and smears it across her chin. When finally entering the bar, her friend, who is also a Chinese sex worker, asks what happened, but Suzie blames it on Lomax. She brags about him beating her 8 or 10 times because he's so crazy for her, and he gets jealous when she spends time with her friends, thinking that she's actually with sailors instead. After hearing this, her friends become excited for Suzie and slightly envious, telling her that it proves that Lomax is in love with her and how lucky she is. Before leaving the bar, Suzie shows off further by saying, "So sorry you don't have a nice man to beat you up." Remember, this dialogue was written and adapted from the imagination of white men, not East or Southeast Asian women, and it clearly suggests that for Suzie and her friends, the criteria of a white lover's devotion is that he cares enough to physically assault his Chinese girlfriend. Not only were her Chinese sex worker peers envious of this abuse, but it was such an established way of thinking amongst them that Suzie deliberately set up the lie in order to boast to her friends. There's another scene where Lomax stalks Suzie after noticing that she disappears every now and again, only to discover that she's been hiding a baby of illegitimate birth. After explaining the situation and Lomax being sympathetic, she softly asks him to beat her up. Despite us never seeing Suzie being beaten up by Lomax, the fact she offers herself up for physical abuse in the hands of her noble white knight, even to the extent of glorifying it, is all part of her construction of the Oriental woman fantasy. Also, Suzie's submission to Lomax is clearly, given the historical context I've provided, a characteristic of the Oriental woman idea, and because this idea of the submissive Oriental woman became an expectation amongst the British and North American imagination, then it was either consciously or unconsciously intended to be enjoyed by the film's Western targeted audience. Again, this isn't to say that the film or novel can't be enjoyed for their own merits, and it's certainly not an attack on those who enjoy them, but it's important that we consider how these ideas of the Oriental woman are so ingrained into the Western imagination, which, like I said earlier, can so easily spill over into how people like myself read into films actually produced in East Asia by East Asian artists.